It is barely dawn and you are already deep in the forest, moving along a path only you can see. The air is thick and green and warm as breath, and it smells of wet earth and smoke. In your hand is a small curved blade, and slung on your shoulder is a battered tin cup. You stop at a tall, pale-barked tree. You know this tree. You know 100 of them out here, each one on a winding trail you walk before the sun gets high. And with a practiced flick you cut a shallow, slanting groove into the bark, just above the last one, so the fresh wounds climb the trunk in a neat herringbone. And then you wait and watch as a thread of white sap, pale as milk, begins to weep out of the cut and run slowly down into your little cup. That sap is why you are here. That sap, thousands of miles away, will become bicycle tires and electrical wire, and soon the tires of a brand new invention called the automobile. Men in London and New York are getting rich on it. You are not. You are soaked in sweat and half-eaten by insects, and quietly in debt to the man who sold you your knife. But here is the thing you do not know, standing at your tree in the gray light. You do not know which country you are standing in. You think of yourself as Brazilian. Most of the men out here are. Most of them came from the same dry corner of Brazil you did. But the maps drawn far away in the capitals of the world say that this ground, these trees, this sweat, all of it belongs to Bolivia. You have never seen a Bolivian official. You have never paid a Bolivian tax. You would not recognize the flag. And within a very few years, that quiet contradiction, the fact that the people on the land and the name on the map do not match, is going to explode into a revolution, a small war, and one of the strangest real estate deals in the history of the world. And at the end of it, this forest and you will be Brazilian after all. Pull up a chair, my friend, because this is one of my favorites. My name is Joaquim. I taught Brazilian history for the better part of 40 years, and if there was ever a story built to keep a bored teenager awake, it is this one, because it has absolutely everything. It has a gold rush, except the gold is a sticky white sap that leaks out of trees. It has a whole population of poor migrants who wander into land that legally is not their country's at all, and simply stay. It has a Wall Street-flavored company that tries to buy a piece of the Amazon like it was buying a warehouse. It has a cattle country cowboy who becomes a revolutionary general, and it ends. And this is the part I love, not with a battlefield, but with a signature, a fortune in gold, and a promise to build a railway that turned out to be one of the deadliest construction projects ever attempted. This is the story of how Brazil got a state called Acre, a chunk of land bigger than a lot of European countries from Bolivia, and I am going to tell it to you carefully and honestly, and I will tell you plainly where the historians still argue, because the arguing is half the fun. So let us go back to the great forest and to the sticky miracle that started it all. You have to start with the rubber, because without the rubber, none of this happens. There is no reason for anyone to fight over a remote patch of jungle at the far western edge of the Amazon. So, the rubber. There is a tree that grows wild across the Amazon basin, and when you cut it, it bleeds this pale latex. People in the region had used it for a very long time, but for most of history the wider world had almost no use for it, because raw rubber is miserable stuff, sticky when it is hot, hard and cracked when it is cold. Then, in the 1840s, a stubborn American figured out how to treat rubber so that it stayed springy and tough in any weather, and everything changed. Suddenly rubber was not a curiosity. It was a material the modern world could not live without. And then the demand went vertical. First, it was the fashion for bicycles. Then it was electricity. All those wires needed rubber insulation. And then came the machine that would eat rubber by the mountain, the automobile, rolling on 4 rubber tires, arriving right at the turn of the century. The industrial world developed a bottomless hunger for rubber. And here is the astonishing part. For a golden couple of decades, almost the only place on Earth you could get it was the Amazon. The Amazon had a near monopoly on the world's rubber, so the money that poured in was staggering. The river cities got rich beyond reason. Manaus, a port deep in the jungle, built itself a grand opera house with imported European marble. And the story goes that the rubber barons were so wealthy they sent their laundry to be washed in Europe. Whether that last one is literally true or just a good line, I will let you decide. But it tells you the scale of the money. Fortunes were made in a single season out here. Whole river cities lit their streets with electricity while great capitals elsewhere still burned gas. They called the latex black gold, and for a while it truly was. And a gold rush, wherever and whenever it happens, needs miners. So who went out into the deep forest to actually collect the stuff? Not the barons, of course. The barons sat in the cities and counted the money. The men who went into the green, the seringueiros, the rubber tappers, were overwhelmingly the poor. And here is the thread that ties this whole story back to the rest of Brazilian history, so let me pull it. Most of them came from the northeast, from the same dry, cracked backlands, the Sertão, that so many of my stories come from. Because in the same decades, the northeast was being hammered by catastrophic droughts. One of the worst, at the end of the 1870s, killed people by the hundreds of thousands and drove waves of refugees off the dying land. And when a man has lost his farm and his animals and watched the sky refuse to rain for years, and someone tells him there is money to be made far away in the west, in the forest he goes. Tens of thousands of them went. They crossed half a continent, from the driest place in Brazil to the wettest, from open thorn scrub to dense dripping jungle, trading one hard life for another. And the life out there was hard in a way that is easy to say quickly, and worth slowing down for. A tapper lived alone or nearly alone, deep in the forest, walking his winding trails of rubber trees before dawn, cutting, collecting, then walking them again to gather the latex, then squatting for hours over a smoky fire, pouring the sap onto a paddle and turning it in the smoke until it built up, layer on layer, into a heavy dark ball of rubber that could weigh as much as a man. Malaria and yellow fever were everywhere, and worst of all was the system that owned him, because he did not tap rubber as a free man selling on an open market. He got his supplies, his food, his tools, his knife on credit from a boss at prices the boss set, and he sold his rubber back to that same boss at prices the boss also set. And somehow the numbers never worked out in his favor. Most tappers lived in permanent debt, chained to the trees by arithmetic they could not escape. This was the black gold rush from the bottom looking up. Hold on to that man at his tree, because he is the one who is quietly about to redraw the map of South America. Now the trouble, and it is a very particular, very human kind of trouble. These tappers, chasing the rubber, kept pushing west and south, ever deeper up the rivers, into a region we can call Acre. And Acre, by the treaties that the governments had signed years before, was Bolivian territory. There had been an agreement back in the 1860s, a line drawn on a map by diplomats, fixing the border between Brazil and Bolivia. And by that line, this whole rich rubber region fell on Bolivia's side. On paper, clean as anything, Bolivian land. But here is where the paper and the world part company, because the men actually out there, cutting the trees, building the little riverside trading posts, living and dying in the forest. They were almost all Brazilians. By most accounts, the overwhelming majority of the population of Acre was Brazilian. They spoke Portuguese. They traded down the rivers into Brazil. Their whole world pointed toward Brazil. And Bolivia, poor, mountainous Bolivia, whose center of gravity was way up in the high Andes, 1,000 torturous miles away, could barely reach the place at all. To get from the Bolivian heartland to Acre, you had to cross some of the most brutal terrain on the planet. Bolivia owned Acre the way you might own a distant patch of moon. It was yours on the deed, but you had never set foot on it and could not easily get there. So you had a region that was legally one country's and actually full of another country's people. That is a contradiction that can sit quietly for a while. But the moment somebody tries to make the paper real, the moment Bolivia decides to actually govern the place it owns on the map, that contradiction turns into a fight. And around 1899, that is exactly what Bolivia tried to do. It looked at this rich rubber region that belonged to it, that was throwing off fortunes, and it thought, reasonably enough, that is ours, and we should be collecting the taxes on all that rubber going out. So it moved to plant its flag for real. It set up a customs post on the river, at a place it meant to run as its gateway, to tax the rubber trade and assert that this was Bolivian soil. You can guess how that went over. To the Brazilian tappers and traders on the ground, this was outrageous. A foreign government they had never dealt with was suddenly appearing on their river and demanding money on the rubber they bled out of the forest with their own hands. And so, they revolted. The early years of this are genuinely messy, and I want to be honest that the sources tell it several different ways, with colorful characters wandering in and out. At one wild point, a Spanish adventurer helped proclaim a short-lived independent Republic of Acre, which flickered and collapsed and flickered again. Do not get too attached to the details of those first uprisings. They were chaotic, improvised, and confused. The thing to take from them is simpler and steady. Again and again, the Brazilian settlers of Acre refused to be governed by Bolivia, and Bolivia could not hold the region against them. The customs post changed hands, tempers rose, and blood was spilled in these first flare-ups, and each time Bolivia sent someone to take charge, the forest and the settlers together wore them down. And the government of Brazil, watching from far away, stayed officially cautious. Because on paper, remember, these were rebels rising up inside another country's legal territory. Brazil could not simply march in without looking like a thief. And it was into this simmering mess that Bolivia dropped the one decision that turned a border squabble into a full-blown crisis. Bolivia, sensible on its own terms, faced a real problem. It owned a gold mine it could not run. It could not reach Acre, could not police it, could not collect from it. So it did something that must have seemed clever in an office far away, and was pure gasoline on the ground. Around 1901, it leased the job out. It handed the exploitation of Acre to an international company. History remembers it as the Bolivian Syndicate backed by British and American financiers. And this was no ordinary business. This chartered company was given something close to governing power over the region. The right to collect the taxes, to run the administration, to police the territory, more or less to rule Acre as a private commercial fief on Bolivia's behalf, and take a cut. It was the kind of arrangement the great powers used in that era to run distant colonies, a company with an army and a customs house. Now think about how that landed. For the Brazilian tappers, it was the nightmare doubled. Not just a foreign government, but a foreign corporation, an outfit of far-off investors, coming to tax and rule the forest they lived in. And this is the part that mattered even more. It alarmed the government of Brazil itself, because now this was not just a question of some rebellious settlers. Now there was the prospect of a powerful, foreign-financed, semi-sovereign company, backed by the money of great powers, planting itself permanently on the Amazon frontier, right up against Brazil. That was a strategic threat Brazil could not shrug off. A quarrel over a customs house was one thing. A foreign corporate power entrenched on the border was another thing entirely. The stakes had just changed for everyone. And that is the moment our cowboy rides in. His name was José Placido de Castro, and he was not, as you might expect, a local rubber tapper. He came from the far south of Brazil, from the cattle country of Rio Grande do Sul. He was a gaucho, a man of the southern plains with military training and experience as a surveyor. He had drifted north and west, as restless men did, into the rubber lands. And when the Acre settlers needed someone who actually knew how to organize men, to plan a campaign, to run something more disciplined than an angry mob, he was the man who stepped into that gap. In 1902, Placido de Castro took command of what became the decisive uprising, the one that history remembers as the Acre Revolution. And this time it was different from the earlier chaos. This was organized. He led the settlers as a real fighting force, campaigning through the flooded forests and along the rivers against the Bolivian troops and authorities in the region. He proclaimed Acre independent again, and this time made it stick, laying siege to the Bolivian strongholds and, through a hard campaign across 1902 and into 1903, defeating the Bolivian forces sent to hold the place. I want to be careful here, the way I always am, because it is tempting to turn this into a clean legend of plucky settlers versus a foreign empire, and real history is muddier than that. Bolivia was fighting at the very end of an impossible supply line, in a climate that killed its highland soldiers as surely as any bullet. The Brazilian settlers were on their home ground and vastly outnumbered the forces Bolivia could actually get there. This was not some miracle of arms. It was, in large part, geography deciding a war, just as it had decided who lived in Acre in the first place. But decide it did. By early 1903, on the ground, Acre was effectively won by the Brazilian settlers, and Bolivia's grip was broken. And behind all of this, quietly at first and then decisively, the government of Brazil had begun to move, because a settler victory on the ground meant nothing at all unless it could be turned into something permanent and legal. And for that, you did not need a soldier. You needed the best diplomat Brazil ever produced. His name was José Maria da Silva Paranhos Jr., but Brazilians know him by his title, the Baron of Rio Branco. And if you remember one name from this whole story other than Acre itself, make it his, because he is one of the great figures of Brazilian history. The man who, more than anyone, drew the modern borders of Brazil, and did it almost entirely with maps, arguments, and patience rather than with armies. He was the foreign minister, a huge, brilliant, encyclopedic man who knew the history of every disputed line better than the people on the other side of the table did. And Rio Branco understood something crucial about the Acre situation. He understood that an outright war between Brazil and Bolivia would be a disaster, costly, ugly, uncertain, and terrible for Brazil's carefully built image as a civilized, law-abiding nation. He did not want to conquer Acre. He wanted to acquire it cleanly, with a signature both sides would put their names to, so that it could never be seriously challenged again. He wanted the world to see not a land grab, but a lawful settlement between gentlemen. So he negotiated. First, he had to deal with that foreign company. The Bolivian syndicate and Brazil essentially arranged to pay it off, to buy out and dissolve the lease, to get the dangerous foreign corporate power out of the picture. And then, with Bolivia, he built the grand bargain. It was signed in the town of Petrópolis, up in the cool hills above Rio de Janeiro, on the 17th of November, 1903, the Treaty of Petrópolis. And here are the terms, because the terms are wonderful, and they are the reason this is not just another war story. By most accounts, it went like this. Brazil would take Acre. The whole rich rubber region would become Brazilian, formally and permanently. In exchange, Brazil would pay Bolivia £2 million. Let me say that again, because it is the twist that makes people sit up. Brazil paid for it. A fortune in gold handed over for the territory. Brazil also gave up and swapped some smaller pieces of land elsewhere along the border to sweeten the deal. But the most interesting clause of all was not about money or land. It was about a railway. Because think about Bolivia's real, permanent problem. Bolivia is landlocked and mountainous, and its natural door to the outside world down in this direction is the river system of the Amazon. But those rivers, right where Bolivia would need them most, are choked by a long stretch of violent rapids and waterfalls. The Madeira and Mamoré rivers crash down over a series of cataracts that no cargo boat can pass. So Bolivia's exports could float down the river, hit that wall of rapids, and go no further. Its own rubber and goods were trapped behind a barrier of white water. So Rio Branco built the solution right into the treaty. As part of the price of Acre, Brazil agreed to build a railway, the Madeira-Mamoré Railway, that would run alongside those unnavigable rapids, a stretch of track through the deep jungle that would let Bolivia's goods bypass the waterfalls and reach the wider river, and so the ocean and the world. It was, on paper, an elegant piece of statesmanship. Brazil gets the land and the people it already effectively had. Bolivia gets a fortune in gold and a railway to the sea. The foreign company gets bought out and sent home, and nobody has to fight a full war over it. Everyone signs. Everyone goes home. On paper. And that railway is where this triumphant story turns, at the very end, into a tragedy. Because the Madeira-Mamoré Railway earned itself a nickname. They called it the Devil's Railroad, and in some tellings, the Railroad of the Dead. There had been an attempt to build it back in the 1870s before all this, and that attempt had collapsed in failure and death. But now it was a treaty obligation, so it had to be done, and the major construction was pushed through in the years around 1907 to 1912. And it was a nightmare almost beyond describing. This was a railway being hacked through some of the most disease-ridden jungle on Earth. The killer here was not really the work, brutal as the work was. The killer was sickness, malaria and yellow fever, and beyond them beriberi and dysentery and a whole catalog of tropical diseases tore through the workforce. And what a workforce it was! They brought in laborers from all over the world, from the Caribbean, from Europe, from the United States, from across the Amazon. Thousands upon thousands of men, and the fever fields swallowed them. The work camps became death camps in the medical sense. Men arrived, sickened within weeks, and died. New ones were shipped in to replace them. Now, here I have to stop and be a careful teacher, because this is exactly the kind of place where a good story goes bad by exaggerating. You will very often hear it said that the Madeira-Mamoré cost one life for every railway tie, for every wooden sleeper laid under the track. It is a haunting line. It is also, almost certainly, folklore, a grim legend, not a measured fact. The truth is that the real death toll is genuinely disputed. Historians give a wide range, and honest estimates run into the thousands, with some tellings reaching many thousands. The record-keeping in a remote jungle full of transient foreign workers was poor, and precise numbers are simply lost. So let me give you the honest shape of it rather than a false precision. An enormous number of people died building this railway, a genuine human catastrophe. But anyone who quotes you an exact figure with confidence is guessing. Where the sources disagree, I tell you they disagree. And here is the final, bitter irony, the kind history seems to specialize in. By the time the Devil's Railroad was finished, around 1912, it was already pointless. Because remember why all of this happened: rubber. And in exactly these years, the Amazon's rubber monopoly died. Years earlier, seeds of the rubber tree had been smuggled out of the Amazon and nursed in far-off gardens, and now vast, orderly rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, in places like Malaya and Ceylon, came flooding onto the world market. Plantation rubber, grown in neat rows, was cheaper and easier than sending a lone tapper into the wild forest. The price of Amazon rubber collapsed. The boom that built the opera house in Manaus and drove the war for Acre simply ended. And so the great railway, built at the cost of all those lives to carry the region's rubber to the world, opened into a world that no longer wanted the region's rubber. It ran for years, carrying almost nothing, a monument through the jungle to a boom that was already over. A student of mine, a quick, argumentative boy named Raphael who liked to catch me out, once stopped me right about here and said, "Professor, wait. Brazil won the fight on the ground. The settlers had already taken Acre. So why on earth did Brazil pay £2 million and build a whole railway for it? Why pay for something you have already got?" And I told him, "Raphael, that is the smartest question in the whole lesson. And the answer is the difference between grabbing something and owning it. Brazil could have simply kept Acre by force and dared the world to object. But a country that seizes land by force makes an enemy, invites a war, and stains its name. A country that pays and signs a treaty and builds its neighbor a railway to the sea, that country gets to keep the land forever, with a clear conscience and a clean reputation, and no one can ever credibly call it a thief. The £2 million did not buy the dirt, Raphael. The dirt was already theirs in every way that mattered. The £2 million bought peace and legitimacy and a border that would never have to be defended again. That, I told him, is what great diplomacy actually buys." And he sat down, and for once he did not argue. So let me gather this up, because there is a lesson buried in the story of Acre that I do not want you to miss, and it is bigger than Brazil and Bolivia. Look at how the map actually got drawn. Not in Petropolis in 1903 with the fine pens and the £2 million in gold. That was just the paperwork. The map really got drawn years earlier, and quietly, and by the poorest people in the story, by that man at the rubber tree in the dark before dawn, and the tens of thousands like him, who walked out of the dying backlands of the Northeast and into a forest that officially belonged to another country and simply stayed. They did not conquer Acre. They did not annex it. They just showed up and lived there and worked and had children and made it, in every real sense, Brazilian, until the fact on the ground was so heavy that the law and the diplomats and the gold all had to come limping along afterwards to make official what the tappers had already made true. And I think there is something in that worth carrying out of this room with you. We tend to believe that the big things borders nations, who belongs where are decided by treaties and armies and great men at tables. And sometimes they are. But underneath the treaty is almost always something slower and more human. The plain, stubborn weight of who actually showed up and stayed and did the work and would not leave. The powerful drew a line on a map and called it settled, and the powerless, one bleeding tree at a time, quietly moved the line. So the next time you look at a map of any country, including your own, I want you to remember Acre and ask a different question of it. Not just who owns this on paper, but who actually went there, who stayed, who sweated, who is buried in the ground. Because behind every clean line on every map, there is a mess of ordinary people who got there first and made the line true. The paper always comes last. Now I would genuinely love to hear from you on this one, so come and find me down in the comments because I do read them. First, the honest question. Had you ever even heard of Acre or of how Brazil came to own it? Because most of the world has no idea a Brazilian state was won by rubber tappers and settled with a railway. And I would love to know how far this forgotten story has traveled. And second, the one I really care about. Can you think of another place, anywhere in the world, maybe even where you live, where the people on the ground and the name on the map did not match, where who lived somewhere and who owned it on paper came apart? Tell me. I collect these. And if you enjoyed this, if you did not know that a sticky white sap that leaks out of trees once redrew the border of South America and cost thousands of lives on a railway to nowhere, then do me one small kindness and subscribe, because my country is stuffed full of stories exactly like this one, wild and true and left out of the school books, and I intend to dig up every last one of them for you. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for sitting with me. And the next time someone shows you a nice clean line on a map and tells you that is simply how it is, think of a man at a rubber tree in the dark and ask who really drew it.